you ready for the incredible sound of classic rock? No? Good, because now it's time for Visiting the Village.
Hello and welcome to Visiting the Village. I'm Paul Kilduff-Taylor and I'm joined as ever by the indelible Ian Hardingham.
Hello Mr. Paul Kilduff-Taylor. I'm going to be communicating you via Morse code with tapping on my table today to attempt to cheat my way to winning this podcast.
Let's get out of this dungeon.
It's the top story.
Developer Daniel West has written a piece for Gamasutra about how the game he made with a small team of students and how it has failed to sell well despite good press, and, in his opinion, being a good game. His conclusion is that it's not enough to do everything right, and that there is an undefinable quality you need to have in order to achieve wide-scale success. Do you agree, Ian Hardingham?
I might agree with that, but I don't generally agree with a lot of the suppositions he's making about his game. This is a pretty terrifying story. They released on Steam and they've sold 150 copies so far, which is absolutely terrifying. And I think with this kind of really gigantic outlier, it's really useful to have a look and try and work out what's going on, because 150 copies when you're getting some press is pretty terrible. So this game looks to me a lot like an iPad or maybe an iPhone physics-y platformer game.
Yeah.
And it's traditionally a kind of genre that does absolutely terribly on Steam. Many times during this post, he refers to the game having beautiful or gorgeous graphics, which I think is completely false. By far the biggest piece of press they had was a Giant Bomb Let's Play that had 500,000 views. And I'm actually willing to make a pretty straightforward assertion that if you are available on Steam and Giant Bomb does a video which is not particularly negative, that has 500,000 views, and you only sell 150 copies, there's something really specific going on. I don't think this is some kind of larger magical viewpoint. When I was watching this video, I was amazed by how much the camera makes it an incredibly unpleasant experience to watch. It's actually something I found it hard to watch the game for more than sort of 20 seconds because the camera moves around in such a weird way as to be absolutely terrible. I think the game is bad. I think the reason that, despite sending out a lot of PR requests, hardly anyone covered the game is because the game is bad, which is what happens nowadays. The worse your game is, the less likely it is to be covered. I think it's inappropriate for the market, and I think that the camera stuff is really incompetent. So I'm afraid I'm pretty down on this game.
So, I mean, I think that you can say what you want to about the graphics. I think some people like these kind of graphics a lot. I don't know if you can say that the game is bad. It's won quite a lot of awards. It's got a reasonable Metacritic. It's not a bad game. They said they had fairly consistent reviews of 70 to 80%. I just think I don't understand, like, by what metric is the game bad?
Yeah, maybe that's going too far. I guess fundamentally unexciting. I think a lot of different kinds of things can get reviewed in the 70 to 80 range, and it can often mean that the game is pretty competent, pretty inoffensive, with a few sort of reasonably nice things about it. I should speak more clearly. The best way to get not covered nowadays is to have a really unexciting game, which is absolutely what this looks like to me as a consumer. In terms of whether or not people like the graphics, I think the graphics are fine for a mobile game. I think they are substandard for a PC game, and they are the kind of thing which contributes to not being very attractive on Steam. Like, this is the kind of game I might play on a free-to-play Portal, maybe. I don't want to be overly harsh, but I actually feel pretty strongly that those kind of criticisms, while they might not be fair on all storefronts, I think are the kind of things that actually do have a big impact on Steam.
Right. So I think one of the things that's going on here is that this is genuinely reflecting a wider situation. In the past, I think this would have sold over 1,000 copies. I think there would have been more interest around something that is as polished as this and clearly has like a couple of interesting things about the gameplay. I agree with you, it kind of smacks of a mobile game. I agree with you, it's in the danger zone of things that can just completely flop on Steam. But I think this magnitude of failure is fairly unprecedented, or rather it's kind of people who make these games don't generally talk about it. Maybe they're starting to talk about it now. I do think this is reflective of a changed market situation, a changed general situation.
I think that the kind of impact you see when you're talking about a gradual change in the marketplace, like the saturation on Steam, leads to relatively gradual changes. When you see a game that might have sold X selling half as much as X or a quarter as much as X, then that's something that, you know, it's fair to suggest that's due to these changing market conditions. When you have a game which performs this atrociously, I think it's much more likely to be something fundamental than that. I mean, you say that in a previous time it would have sold thousands. It's always so hard to predict based on that. I think that for me, I would be interested, like, you know, if it was released in 1990, because it would look so far advanced of anything that was out in 1990, it would do incredibly well. So for me, it's hard to separate how long you'd have to go back, you know, just to the point of the sort of the golden age of indies where there wasn't much stuff around. I still don't view this as getting a lot of attention. On the other hand, if it was released alongside Gish in 2005 or 2006, I think that it could have maybe got sort of Gish levels of attention. So I think there's a difference between comparing to those two almost separate sort of super golden ages that had very different feelings to the more current situation of a rolling increase in saturation.
Yeah, I mean, yes, I think straightforwardly we probably agree in that I would say if you put this out 10 years ago, it would have sold 10 times as many copies as it did this year. And I think the main reason for that is the change in the market. I think everything about this game puts it in a dangerous category. And I also think it's interesting that the reason I asked you about kind of metrics for it being good are that they have a lot of conventional metrics for it being okay, which is being selected to be displayed at a lot of shows and getting sort of above 50% type reviews. And what we're increasingly seeing is that is not acceptable for something which you expect to have any kind of meaningful commercial success whatsoever. It's absolutely not.
Well, so I definitely agree with that, and I think that I want to go a bit further. I'm trying to synthesize this properly. There are lots of different kinds of, as I was saying, games that get 75%, and you can get a very, very exciting, interesting, terribly executed first-person shooter that gets 50%, that is sort of frankly 1,000 times more interesting than this. So I actually think that getting selected for indie showcases is not a particularly good correlator with being very attractive to consumers, actually. I think the kind of games that are selected for those shows are often slightly different, and I'm not at all surprised that this got selected for those things. And again, in terms of, I think something that's sort of utterly bland and blah, which is the feeling I get from the culmination of all the information I'm getting about this game, is the kind of thing that will just get sort of 75%. And I think that blithely saying that a game is good if it has a 75% on Metacritic is actually not necessarily completely accurate. I think a game that has kind of a narrow set of reviews in the 70s is a different kind of sort of mediocre to a game that has a big spread between the 50s and the late 80s.
I think another possible problem here is the price. It's £7. And as you said, it most closely evokes a kind of £1 50p mobile game by how it looks. People generally take these things very superficially. So £7 for this, I think, is completely out of, like, it's insane. Like, I could never, ever expect this to work at that price.
Yeah, £7 is definitely too much. And while I remember, there's actually another data point I have, which is extremely similar to this story. There's a game that was released on, I think it was both PlayStation 3 and the Vita. I can't remember its name, but it was a platformer. I think it involved rodents of some kind, and it was a similar kind of situation. They'd taken the game to a lot of shows, they'd got a lot of people playing it at shows and saying they really liked it, and then it sold something absolutely terrible on release, and I'm talking about in the number of hundreds. Now, the thing that I want to say about that is, how good are you at understanding what feedback at a show means? One of the things that he says here is that of the 150 people who bought the game, a vast majority say they really, really like it. One person even says that it's their favourite game of the year. Now, I've actually been around for long enough and have been involved with enough different quality projects to have an understanding that that is absolutely meaningless. And in fact, that's a terrible percentage, basically. If you have very small sales, the data you get within those sales is actually close to meaningless. It's too small a sample size and it's too pre-selected. So again, I kind of apologise for being so unbelievably negative about this, but this actually just seems to me about a lot of denial and sort of trying to blame something on a larger specific issue when there are sort of just a huge number of small problems with it.
I can never remember the name of that game. I think it's called something like Ethan's Odyssey or...
Yes, that rings a bell, yeah.
Odyssey or something. It was another one of these Gama Sutra things. Yeah, and I think that people have really... You're right. People put themselves in this hugely dangerous category. Doing an action platformer on Steam is a massively dangerous category. People consider those generally to be console games. And when you hear people talking about things like Super Meat Boy or these really crossover, or Trine, or these really crossover platform things, you just think that you're kind of way off base with what the expectations are. People generally expect those things to be mobile or console games.
The difference between this game and Super Meat Boy is not some indefinable magic. It's a completely definable magic. Like, Super Meat Boy had several things which really popped about it. It was edgy for the time. It was perfect in terms of how retro it was for the time it was released. And it had real hooks that got you excited straight away. This has none of those hooks for me. And again, I want to stop being negative about this poor game, because there are some nice things about it. And I'm going to have to play it now. Otherwise, I'm going to sort of be unable to sleep out of guilt. But that's how I feel about it.
Well, I mean, the problem is that it's fine. Like, do I sympathise with the developers? Of course I do. I don't want to make them feel like they've done something wrong and they should never try making a game again. Our first game was a failure, and a lot of people said loads of negative things about it constantly to us for many years. It is just something that you'll have to get used to. So in many ways, this is a good experience. How patronising is that? And I think that these guys, they need to just really look at what was going on with the game specifically, as you said, and then try and use that when they do something else. Try and use that to figure out, are they putting themselves in a category where they have to do something exceptional to get any traction whatsoever? It is astonishing the number of copies this have sold. I share their disbelief about that. It seems completely mad that it would be so massively buried to that extent, and that's worrying. But in fact, maybe... just look at the context of what you're doing and the content of what you're doing as well, rather than necessarily saying everything is about the indie-pocalypse, the end of indie games.
Good. Let's move on from this.
Apparently, Ubisoft are getting into the theme park business. The company hopes to open a park in Malaysia in 2020. Existing theme park tycoons RSG will own and operate the park, while Ubisoft's motion picture department will handle the creative side of things. Perhaps hoping to preempt the snark, they had this to say on their corporate blog. Have you ever played one of Ubisoft's games and thought, this is fun and all, but I'd really like to experience it as a theme park ride? Good news! That wish will soon become reality. Are there any games that you would like to experience as a theme park ride, Ian Hardingham?
I would love to have a magic carpet themed roller coaster.
Yes.
That would be absolutely awesome. Please spend $100 million on doing that right now. The first thing I'm afraid that I thought about when I read this story is that it isn't quite as entertaining as the unlicensed World of Warcraft theme park in China from an earlier Visiting the Village episode. It's still fairly entertaining. Most of the things people want to talk about in relation to this are to do with DRM and about getting to the top of a roller coaster and having pay more money just to get to the bottom of it, or What happens if their servers go down while you're on the
Yeah.
rotating teacups? This could be quite cool. Like, I feel like I would like to go to this and see what they do with the Assassin's Creed ride, and that sort of thing. What do you think?
I think, well, I've got my answer for the game I'd like to experience. I'd like to see the interactive theatre version of Her Story. I think
that's a very cool idea.
Right, I think that would be good. I just thought of that. I'm very proud of myself.
You should tell Nottingham Game City about that, because they might actually do that in their central tent.
I would. It's done. Everything is done. I'd go to this. I think. I mean, I guess the Deus Ex ride could be good. I probably enjoy the rides more than I enjoy Ubisoft games, to be honest. But there we go. Ron Gilbert has written publicly about the budget and schedule for his latest game, Thimbleweed Park, in an attempt to assuage fears that there might not be enough money to complete development. In a post on the game's development blog, he goes to great lengths to describe how important it is to constantly reevaluate and anticipate your spending, but that it's not that important to dwell on money that you've already spent. Is this a good approach to budgeting?
The sound you cannot hear is me sighing in relief that this is a reasonably sensible opinion piece about how to budget and create your indie game. Ron Gilbert's a fiery character. He likes trolling around online quite a lot, and he's got a funny blog. But I pretty much agree with most of this. He's trying to tell the audience in a relatively straightforward way that $500,000 is not very much when it comes to game development. And he's right, it's not very much when it comes to games development. That's pretty much how much they raised for Thimbleweed Park, which looks pretty cool. One of the interesting things about this is that he says that, when you're working under a publisher, in a traditional publisher-developer arrangement, if you go over budget by 10 or 20%, it's not really a huge deal. They might get a bit annoyed with you, you might have to pay some punitive measures on the back end, but it's probably not going to sink the game from getting released. But obviously, when you're the guy who is funding it, and all the money you've got for it comes from Kickstarter, what are you going to do? If you know it's going to go over by 20%, are you going to take out a loan? Are you going to call it quits? Are you going to not finish the game? Are you going to run a different Kickstarter? I think those are all pretty interesting questions.
Yeah, he does make some good points here. I think one thing that people may find hard to grasp, and I actually kind of wrestle with this slightly when he said it, is this thing about not worrying about money you've already spent. I think that there is a point with a lot of games where you might have spent slightly too much on development, and then you know that you need X to finish the game. And the problem is that compromising on important polish, the stuff that happens at the end of development, is very rarely a good economy. If the game's going to make any money at all, it's usually down to a lot of things that you do late on. And I think that's something that people find very hard to grasp, especially with these Kickstarter projects, where you might have everything mapped out and sort of planned to a reasonable degree, which isn't a sensible and important thing to do. But there definitely comes a point where you just have to finish the game to the extent that it will convey its original ideas. I think that could be very tough.
Yeah, sure, definitely. I agree with that. An interesting aspect of this is that Gilbert talks about how much he and his co-founder are paying themselves. He says that they're earning far less than they would be at real jobs, in inverted commas. He says about a quarter of what they would be earning at real jobs. I'm kind of interested by the sentiment and by the percentage. I understand whenever you're possibly under attack by a bunch of Kickstarter supporters that maybe you're not doing things right, or you want to make it clear that despite the fact you have $500,000, it's not the same as having $500,000 to just buy a boat with. It's sort of defensive to a certain extent. I think it's good for people to understand that. On the other hand, I don't, that they're 25% of what they'd earn at real jobs is probably, I'm just guessing, sort of, $25,000 a year or something, which is not a lot, just about enough. But the important thing why I wouldn't feel that sympathetic for them is that they are investing in something that could pay off really well. They're going to reap all of the profits if it does really well, and that kind of math when it comes to this kind of gamble is a totally great thing to be doing.
Right, absolutely. I mean, you're in such difficult territory here with this, because if you start talking about how much you get paid, people have such a massive range of responses to that it's almost completely pointless to discuss it in any way. The common kind of responses to these things now are always like, oh, my friend made a game in his spare time for free and he didn't pay himself anything, or people in Russia will happily develop games for $1,000. And it's just like that, the conversation, even beyond the usual difficulties of talking about money and people's wages, it just degenerates so far. So I think he's handled this quite well. It is a difficult thing to discuss. Whether or not people will ever understand this stuff better is something that I find confusing. People relate this again to Kickstarter a lot, but as we've seen, Kickstarter is a tremendously emotional thing, and I just don't know if you're ever going to really change the conversation with this kind of thing.
Kickstarter is a tremendously emotional thing, and I think I've probably got to the stage where I can't even be bothered to try and explain things that are sort of definitely true, but a lot of people just don't get. There are people who are in all sorts of different living conditions and situations, and you sort of slightly mentioned it when you were talking about how an income level can mean a vast amount different to a vast number of different people. So, you know, it's like Kickstarter's a thing that works. I've raised this much money, and I'm just going to own the fact that I'm now going to use it in the way that I believe is right to try and make the game in the best possible way. And I think it's important to describe what you're doing without being too defensive. One thing I wanted to talk about this with you specifically, he talked about the music budget. He said that $1,000 a minute for music is quite common. Yep. What do you think about a game with as low a budget as this using that high quality music?
Yeah, the $1,000 per minute for music thing is a thing I hear quoted a lot. So it doesn't seem like people always want there to be these industry standard rates for creative work, and there never are, but that's kind of as close to that as you would get. So that's sort of a not unreasonable rate. Yeah, it's very, 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 very difficult to price music, and people care about music a lot. It's very difficult for a developer to be able to guarantee that music will be good because it's such a subjective thing. So the way that you hedge against that is that you pay a good amount of money to someone who is respected and experienced, and then they deliver music which you sort of hope people will like. For this kind of game, I feel like, I mean, it depends on what the length of the score is. If it's a 60-minute long score, then that's a lot of money, I think, for this kind of budget. I think you could get someone talented who would be willing to do it for less. Sorry to all my composer friends for selling you short there, but I do. And I just think it's massively, massively hard. Yeah, I'm kind of all for these projects providing opportunities to newer composers. I think there are a lot of people out there who are very good who don't get the opportunity to work on this kind of thing and might do it for less. I feel like I might be getting myself in trouble here, so I might stop talking.
Okay. Now, this game is basically a sequel to Maniac Mansion.
Yeah.
Do you have any idea how many minutes of music there are in an adventure game like that?
Probably quite a lot, I would imagine, because like animations in adventure games, music is generally used kind of as a reward. The older games certainly didn't have very much. I mean, something like Monkey Island only had a few different looping pieces of music, I believe. They tend to be quite short pieces. So there's that. I mean, it depends what they're going for.
Yeah, I understand that you're going to get in trouble if you talk too much about how much money you would spend as a developer, but I feel like I'm slightly more free to do it. I think that Gilbert's worked with Lucasfilm for so long. He's probably used to having access to an orchestra. I don't know if that's unfair, but that's kind of the impression I get. And I imagine he probably feels quite good about spending a lot of money on music. If this was my project, I've always been astounded by the quality of, especially the chiptune kind of stuff that is made by people who are young and working, working for passion, really. So I would probably always try and go and get someone like that, because I just find a lot of great stuff in there. And obviously I don't have to do that because I'm lucky enough to be partnered with you. Mm-hmm. But I think that's maybe a part of the budget that I'd look at clipping.
Yeah, totally. I think you can. Like I said, I think I adequately explained the reasons behind it. It's that you want to somehow guarantee that this very amorphous creative thing will be great, because people care about music a lot. One of the other problems is that you get into this vicious cycle where people are paying the money for that, so they want things that sound sort of obviously good. So they want stuff that really recalls other things or is kind of good by these sort of very obvious metrics, and the whole thing is a bit of a mess, really. So I do actually agree with you. I think think finding an upcoming person can be a good way of doing this. Obviously paying them a fair rate, and the flip side of this is to get myself out of trouble finally. If you're a composer and someone is pitching a project to you, then don't be afraid to set what you believe is a decent rate, what you think is fair for you to be paid at your level. And maybe that is $1,000 a minute, and then you'll raise the price for everyone else. But certainly I think devs should be looking around for these opportunities to bring up new musicians, and musicians should be responding accordingly.
Let's move on.
Developers of edutainment software Serious Games Interactive have removed a minigame from one of their titles after coming under intense pressure on social media. The minigame in question was a variant of Tetris where the player had to pack contorted slaves into the hold of a ship as efficiently as possible. Ian Harding, were the developers being deliberately provocative with slave Tetris or just incredibly tone deaf?
I'm very excited to talk about this story. Slave Tetris, the only thing funnier than the name is the screenshots of this ridiculous minigame. Now, I actually feel quite legitimately torn on this issue, because while this is pretty, you could call it tone deaf, and all of the slaves in Slave Tetris are black, for instance, which might be historically somewhat accurate. It's just the kind of thing that will make this even more difficult, shall we say. On the other hand, there's such a rich history in games of edutainment titles having ludicrous minigames to represent some weird historical thing. Of like just the silliest genres being pushed into you crossing the river or something, that it sort of almost feels sad that we have to move on from that as a society.
Right. I think this is quite complicated, actually. On the face of it, this is just absolutely ludicrous. It's one of those things where the comedian Stuart Lee said, when you're defending freedom of speech, you end up defending crap stuff. Like, it's always the jokes, the offensive jokes that get people angry are always shit. And you have to sort of defend this shit art. And I think that this is kind of crappy. I mean, again, sorry to the developers. I think Slave Tetris is a stupid thing to put in your game because it's not going to really reveal anything interesting about the history, is it? It's going to... What does it say? It was difficult to get all these people in ships and there were a lot of them in the ships. That's the entire content of what it's saying. And you're taking this enormous... if offensive, tone-deaf, insensitive risk. At the same time, saying that you can't ever make a kind of parodical, silly game out of a very sensitive, important issue, saying that you can never do that, I think might be wrong, because the way that you process things culturally is to deal with them through a lot of different lenses, even silly minigames and edutainment titles. The problem with this is that it's just specifically so far removed from anything that could ever teach anyone anything that I just don't think you can really justify it in this instance. I think the outrage is generally right, and I think this was a dumb idea.
Yeah, I tried desperately to make the case that the developers were really making a sort of a strongly ironic point about this, and I actually think that you probably could make Slave Tetris as a reflection on sort of some aspects of what we do in our spare time versus what was going on a couple of hundred years ago. But I think that, unfortunately, they definitely weren't. And I think one of the other problems is, when you have... It's just such an attractive story that, of course, it's going to go viral. I mean, again, we can't show the screenshots of this game, but they really look probably significantly funnier than you actually imagine. Like, it's exactly the kind of thing that's going to go viral straight away. You were talking about defending freedom of speech and freedom of art. I almost feel that the current climate where the rush to decide whether something is acceptable or not is so sudden and involves such a huge number of people, and the reward for being decided to be okay is nothing, and the perils of being decided that you're not okay are so terrible that it's really kind of a difficult situation right now. I mean, having said that, this is not necessarily the game that I want to go to bat for in terms of freedom of art, because it's kind of silly. But the reason why I'm still talking about it is because I honestly just have these great memories of all these stupid mini games, and this just feels like one of them. And I tried to think of a way in which this could be made less offensive, but I couldn't really think of any.
No,
So
it's not possible. I think I'm with you on this. Like, you can see. I mean, the developers have written a response, which you can see in the Eurogamer article about this that we're referencing. They've written a response to it, and they deal with all the different points. And, you know, one of the questions they respond to is people saying slave Tetris is a mockery and insensitive. And the developer says, I definitely agree it is insensitive and gruesome. It has to be like this to show what was done to load slave ships. People treated human beings as pieces that just had to be fitting into the cargo. And that's like, as I said, if this was saying something useful and interesting and it had a range of things to say about this topic, which I think some offensive humour and comment does, then it would be easy to defend. But it doesn't. It's too stupid to defend. And that's when you really put yourself in the hole. Nobody can come out and say, hey, actually, you know, these guys should be allowed to do this, because it doesn't fulfill its function. It's not educational in a meaningful way. And yes, we can be nostalgic about funny minigames and stuff, but at the end of the day, this stuff does have a remit and it's supposed to be about education, and I think it fails.
let's move on.
According to analytics and marketing firm Delta DNA, there are 5 golden rules for retaining players. Those 5 rules are: make onboarding astonishing, too hard too soon, make it worth my while, repeat, and the inclusion of daily incentives. We're going to discuss what those are in a minute. Ian Hardingham, are those rules a surefire route to F2P riches, or just good general principles of game design?
I think some of the things that we're going to talk about are good principles of game design. The reason that I put this in our list of topics this week, this article was promoted to me on Twitter, and it's sort of one of those incredibly standard sort of commercial guides that doesn't really have any depth, that's just really for getting some people on their mailing list, etc. So this is not from a games website. This is sort of more of a commercial thing that you may be able to define better than me. But I think sometimes it's actually kind of worth looking at what this is the kind of thing that Michael Pachter might refer to with one of his very high paying clients. You know, it's interesting to see what the very business commercial, completely divorced from any kind of sort of passion or gamer stuff view on all this stuff is. And I was interested to read some of them. I think probably the most cogent this guide gets is about daily incentives. It's a relatively straightforward point, but when you give someone a reward for coming back and playing a game every day, and specifically giving them this kind of streak reward of the more days in a row you come back, the bigger the reward is a clearly really good thing to do. And I think that obviously getting people to engage with your game at a certain time every day is a massive win for F2P people. Some of the other stuff I think is a bit less clear. They talk about how your games should be endless if you want to make a lot of money in F2P, because you want people to keep playing forever. They reckon that being able to replay certain areas is really important. So that's pretty interesting. I suppose that could be said to be obvious. Actually, they say that this makes it hard for narrative games to become successful free-to-play games. And me and you, Paul Kilduff Taylor, have spent a lot of time arguing that specific point. So I was sort of slightly surprised to find something that specific in here, actually. Did any of this catch your eye?
Yeah, I think there's some interesting stuff here. The daily incentives thing is something that personally I really dislike. It's probably one of the free-to-play style things that I dislike most. When I see that a game has that, like Alpha Bear has that, for example, it really reminds me, it basically completely breaks my suspension of disbelief. It reminds me that, oh yeah, this is one of those games where it's going to be bugging me to do things, and it really wants me to come back. It comes across as too desperate to me, too blatant. And that's never a problem with F2P. Being too blatant has been shown repeatedly to not be a problem. So it's something that's personal to me. That just kind of evoked that in me. Also, it struck me that, as you say, these are all kind of completely divorced from any creative ideals, which I think can be quite good for this sort of meta-structural stuff. But things like a smooth difficulty curve, there are so many games for different demographics that absolutely break that rule, and are interesting because they break that rule, that it really struck me as soon as you make these rules for types of creative endeavour, it's the stuff that absolutely violates the thing you shouldn't violate that becomes the breakout hit, that becomes something interesting. So although there are these good general principles in here, I'm kind of interested about like which ones of these things could you break and still have a successful game.
Yeah, I mean, it really feels like the kind of document that an intern might write for you, basically. Sort of just the most sort of generally accepted obvious points. I completely agree that the difficulty curve thing is really difficult, and actually it's something I struggle with as a designer. We're actually redoing the Frozen Cortex tutorial this week, and I've again been trying to look at what I think is important in difficulty curve and in learning, and divorced from a tutorial, one of the things that really turns me off as a player is when something has that is too easy for too long. I like to lose straight away in a game. I like to be challenged straight away, and I think I've decided that I like to separate out tutorial from the first level, so you can kind of have the best of both worlds. But that's still something that I'm working on. So yeah, them just saying it needs to be too sort of really easy straight away. On the one hand, I kind of disagree that personally as a player, but on the other hand, we talk about this. It seems like we talk about this every single week. There are huge numbers of people who never want to lose at a game, who only want reinforcement, who only want to experience sort of constant, monotonically increasing rewards from games. And a lot of those people are the people who pay for free-to-play games. So that's just an area that I don't understand at all, which I think is hugely important to this demographic.
I think it's almost like the difference between people who read for pleasure and people who read in order to experience interesting art. I think that the gamers who play for pleasure are the people who just want to experience something that is basically kind of reinforces their existing situation. So they want something which is relaxing, that isn't going to push them too hard mentally, that they can sort of see this gentle progression through. And that's completely fine, just like reading for pleasure is completely fine. If you think that's not fine, then you're a snob, basically. But I think for people who are interested in games sort of in their own right, they are much more willing to accept things that take them out of their comfort zone, that might make them feel uncomfortable or maybe frustrated initially. And then they'll have the sort of awareness to go, hey, why am I feeling frustrated? Is this a skill thing? Is this a knowledge thing? And they'll sort of analyze the problem, and the problem is interesting to them. And I still feel like we haven't really, as you say, we think about these things a lot. It's difficult to reconcile those things. Like in which situation is it best to choose an approach where the player is confronted with a big obvious problem, and in which situation are you just being a dick to the player, and any player is going to run away in fear? That's very, very difficult. So these things don't have any ambiguity in them, do they? Like especially this thing about onboarding, that you have to throw all this incredibly exciting stuff at the player straight away. Some games, if you look at the Crusader Kings 2 tutorial, which is something that we've talked about, that's a very good tutorial, but it's very gentle, and it just step by step slowly reveals more about the game, and you start to gently go through this progress of understanding the depth of the game. So with all of these rules, I think there are not only exceptions, but also entire debates behind them.
Yeah, I agree with that. Just to finish on this final point that you referred to, make onboarding astonishing, which is a very silly way of saying that the start of your game should be really exciting. It says, if you have cool content like a cloak of awesomeness or an exciting ultimate flying zombie cat bonus level, do you really want to wait until 90% of players have abandoned your game before it comes into play? This is a really difficult point, actually. Working out how much of the really interesting things about your game you put in straight away and how much you leave until later. And I actually think that's beyond free-to-play and beyond this article, that's kind of the most interesting point here. Because when you're talking about tutorials and you're talking about learning, if you have a game that has a huge number of different systems, like, for instance, the Metal Gear Solid games that we're going to talk about later, you've got to get the right balance between introducing them slowly enough that you don't completely overload the player, but introducing them fast enough that the player really understands what's exciting about your game straight away. And that's actually one of the hardest things to do. And I really want to see what a game has straight away. Like, that's just important to me. I don't want to have to wait 3 levels before I find out that the core mechanic is this thing. On the other hand, if you have some of the greatest stories about games from people who love a specific game are about this amazing thing that happened halfway through, and it was really because of their investment in the game that they could really connect with it. So that's just not a straightforward thing to do.
Yeah. Knowing sort of when to show your hand in a game is really interesting. Eurogamer had a really great video recently of Miyamoto looking at the first level of Super Mario Brothers and just talking through all these design decisions. Like originally the first opponent that you had was whichever the turtle one is, the Koopa Trooper, where you have to jump on it and then hit the shell. And he said that was so hard for players to do. They invented a new type of enemy, which is the one that you just bounce on and that dies. And that teaches you to bounce on the enemy, but then you don't have to do this complex skill thing of bouncing on it twice to kill it. Stuff like that. Gaps that you could fall down which wouldn't kill you, which would teach you about how to jump over a gap so that when you saw an actual gap that would kill you, you could do it properly. All of these little subtle things. And of course, the first level of Super Mario Brothers is incredibly fun to play. You can play that level and just feel like you've done something really, really fun, but in fact you've managed to internalize all these skills that will let you play the game. That's the ideal, and it can generally only work perfectly in extremely simple games. But that's such a nice way of doing that, where you both kind of show what the game is, but you're subtly getting the player to learn how to do things.
Yeah, this ideal of being able to create a game, like Mario in this instance, be able to sit someone down and sort of see the first problem they have and create a very direct solution to that problem in the form of implied learning, and then move on to the next problem they have. It's an awesome ideal, but I kind of think that with a lot of the more advanced games nowadays, I'm just not sure that's possible. It's something that we try and do, and maybe it is more possible to do, but having a process of really learning while you're playing without being taught feels like something which is extremely hard to do.
Yeah, again, the more complex games tend to break this down into very sort of specific individual tasks that you have to do that make you feel like you've accomplished something, which is much more about how you teach something very, very complicated. I mean, you're not going to learn music theory by playing scales on the piano, but you might learn how to play Twinkle Twinkle Little Star by doing that. So there are always these different styles of learning that you can use in different games. But it is interesting that everything always tends towards this ideal of sort of intuitive learning. I guess because people are there generally to have fun and they don't want to sort of learn something first in order to have fun later, in general. But again, it varies with different types of games, of course.
Let's move on.
Cheating at chess has been in the news recently after a player was kicked out of an Italian tournament for cheating. The referee suspected the player because he was blinking in an unusual manner and holding his hand under his armpit, something which I do on a daily basis. Further investigation revealed he was wearing a concealed camera and communicating in Morse code to persons unknown. Another high-profile story of cheating back in April involved a grandmaster checking his moves by going to the toilet and consulting a smartphone hidden behind the cistern. Is it okay to cheat if you come up with a suitably madcap scheme, Ian Hardingham?
I guess not. Sorry to be boring. No, it's not. Right, chess cheating, and we're going to get onto bridge cheating in a bit, which is close to my heart. But let's start off with this chess cheating business. The thing that could surprise me most about this storyline, and it really probably shouldn't have, but that it was even sort of particularly useful for a grandmaster to be using a computer algorithm to check his moves. And I thought about it a lot, and I decided that the key word is check. It's not that the computer's really telling him what to do. It's about him getting an idea of what move he's going to make and just using the computer to check that it doesn't have some really terrible implications that he hadn't thought about. Yep. So that's my decision on that. I could be wrong, but that's what I was thinking. Cheating. This guy had this pendant with a camera and a transmitter in it, and he was tapping something under his arm to tell the computer what he was thinking about doing or something. It all seems so arcane.
Yeah, so these are two different cases. The tapping, we believe, was to a human, and I think the phone in the toilet was potentially to a computer.
Well, I think the human, though, was plugging this stuff into a computer.
Oh, I see.
I believe that is true.
That's very inefficient.
Yes, it does.
So many factors. Yeah, the camera in the pendant was amazing. I mean, it's definitely kind of movie thing. This stuff really interests me because it's like with chess, I don't know at what point do you decide to do this, because surely the entire point of this, I know you can make money playing chess, and maybe this guy made a bit of money and that was sort of enough for him to do that, but I think you only really make money at the very high levels of chess, I assume. So did he think he could do this like throughout his career and not get caught? That's the weird thing about this. I mean, it's so arcane. Like, I just don't know what the motivations are here.
I don't really understand cheating in this scenario, but it does happen a lot. Because I'm generally more interested in being good than I am in winning, specifically. I want to be good enough to win, but I'm more interested in personal sort of expertise than the pure act of winning. I mean, and I view this very differently to steroids, because trying to overcome the limitations of the human body, especially during an injury, seems like a much more sort of a thing you could much more justify to yourself than this, which is what? What's your justification? Oh, I'm hungover today. I'm not quite on form. I should be able to use this computer because at my best, I'm much better than this. There's no really good self-justification there. We talk about cheating a lot on Visiting the Village, it seems. It's quite an exciting area. It's kind of like the bleeding edge of competitive gaming, and certainly pro gaming brings in a lot of interesting ways in which you can cheat. And this is like the original game, and people are cheating with it.
For me, it kind of has sort of some of the romance of hacking to it. Like, you have this system and you are so committed to defeating the system that you're willing to think outside the law. And that's something about that, to me, is so extreme, and it's nothing that I would ever do, because these competition rules are there for a purpose. I mean, we have also Visiting the Village bridge correspondent Joe Clacy has sent us some information about bridge cheating, which we can kind of move on to that now. Now, bridge cheating is interesting, isn't it? Because it involves communication with your partner, which is illegal on every level.
Yeah, so I would say that I would find it a lot more romantic in general if cheating wasn't so easy. The simple fact of the matter is that because the vast majority of people don't cheat, these aren't these super hardcore environments where it's, you know, it requires a hacking team from a heist movie to work out how to do it. In general, it's kind of just having the balls to try it and not being a complete idiot. So, you know, it's funner if it's actually harder to do. Now, yeah, bridge is an almost unique situation because it's this 2-on-2 game where you're not allowed to communicate in any way with your partner about your hand beyond this very broad game stuff that you can do. So I've often tried to think of any other games that are particularly like it, and I can't really, because you know, you have to communicate with your partner because you're at the same table and you are bidding with each other and that sort of thing. So you have to be able to communicate with your partner, but there's a huge amount of complexity about what you can and cannot tell him, and what information that you could gain from him sort of naturalistically you cannot react to. If he looks particularly bored at some point during the game, and you think that's because he doesn't have a very exciting hand, you absolutely cannot respond to that. And quite a lot of bridge judgments goes down to you needing to justify your actions based around the information that you're allowed to have, and it's really quite a fun thing to look at when this kind of stuff starts going off. So this story is about an Israeli pair who have a long history of cheating. They were banned for cheating when they were teenagers, I think, and quite salacious story where their teammates eventually stopped being their teammates, then lost to them in a major competition, and now have made a pretty startling whistleblower blog post where they've said that these guys are cheating. So what did you think about this?
Well, it's interesting. There's a couple of points that Joe made which are very interesting. He said people knew they were cheating for a long time. This is something that you can do in bridge. You can analyse the play versus what a good person would do, or it's been posited that you should have this panel of top people and you can look at the play versus what they would do, and then if it deviates from that in certain instances it becomes very obvious that the person is cheating, mostly because I believe that the moves you're making are just bad. Like, they're just bad moves. They don't give you an advantage at the time, so it's not like you're playing better than a good person. You're just playing weirdly and wrongly.
So that's basically right. So so there are plenty of judgment calls on a day of competitive bridge, And, you know, on any one day, you might make sort of 10 or 20 off percentage plays under normal circumstances, but you certainly wouldn't expect those to correlate with high leverage situations necessarily, and certainly you wouldn't expect to be converting a lot of them into great situations. So obviously it starts looking pretty suspect when you're making a very bizarre play that happens to work given the actual lie of the cards, but is a really bad percentage play. I talked to Visiting the Village Bridge correspondent Joe Clacy about this at length, and I agree with him that a way that you could do a good job of eradicating cheating would be to have this panel that looks at the weird decisions you made and then interviews you about them. On the other hand, that's exactly the kind of thing where even if the panel finds you guilty, you deny it to high heaven, and you just constantly do a Lance Armstrong and never accept that you actually did cheat. And I think this is one of the problems with this cheating stuff in general. No one wants anyone else to be cheating. It's all very embarrassing, and no one really wants to catch anyone cheating. They just want them to stop doing it. And it's such a drain on resources. And in these kind of games like chess and bridge, there isn't a lot of money involved. You know, this isn't high-level poker or soccer. You know, they don't have seas of money to get the best possible solution for it. So it's just kind of a bit nasty.
Yeah, absolutely. That's kind of back to my original point, really, which is that it's just people who've gone so far down this line of wanting to win that they just start to sort of think outside the game systems itself. And I can definitely understand why that happens, but it just seems a bit bizarre. The lengths that people then go to subsequent to that to do that seem very, very extreme. But yeah, bridge is always a fascinating case, and I agree with you. I don't think there are any good analogies for it in terms of cheating, but they also do seem to have these very epic, long-standing, multi-year cheating scandals, kind of more so than anything else. I guess it's because it's open to it, really.
Yeah, they do, and you know, it's so hard to detect. And it's never completely clear. So they're quite exciting, but one of the problems is you hardly ever get closure because no one ever admits to it.
Crass cultural stereotypes, as we seem to be talking about a lot this week, have long been a part of fighting game character design, but perhaps reflective of a new era, Microsoft have gone to some lengths to rehabilitate one of the old characters from Killer Instinct. With the help of a member of the Nez Perce tribe, they have redesigned Chief Thunder, now renamed Thunder, to be more culturally sensitive, avoiding some of the worst cliches while maintaining a larger-than-life appearance consistent with the other characters in the game. Is there room for subtlety in fighting game character design?
I guess there is. I mean, I presume that the reason I'm being asked this question is because fighting games are the bastion of lack of subtlety.
Yes.
Every fighting character is the most stereotypical thing that you can have of that thing. I guess there is room for subtlety. I mean, what do you think?
This is really interesting, especially coming out this week. So we've got this, and then we've got Hot Ryu. I don't know if you've seen Hot Ryu, because you don't spend as much time on social media as I do. Are you aware of Hot Ryu?
I'm not sure I am, actually.
Okay, I'm going to have to explain Hot Ryu to you via the medium of words, which is pretty interesting. So Hot Ryu is an alternative skin for Ryu in Street Fighter V, where he has this kind of very trim beard. I believe he's topless and wearing a pair of pants. Now, Hot Ryu has come under a lot of internet attention because people feel like this might be sort of maybe one of the first times a male character has been sort of over-sexualized in one of these games. Hot Ryu apparently is pretty sexy. And people are kind of into that. Also, we've had these new characters for Street Fighter. I think she's called Aramika, who's another character that has a sort of female character, ludicrous breasts and a ludicrous costume, and it's all very silly. So people are definitely kind of, there's the old school, unrepentant, basically sexist, ludicrous fighting game design, and then there's this kind of new school of like, let's try and do something different with a male character, and then back to Thunder. I actually think this is really great. It's one of the things that I've seen on the show recently that I just want to unreservedly praise. Because you have this character who is a kind of Native American stereotype character, and instead of cutting it because you think it will offend people, you go to someone who is an ethnographer who studies this stuff, who is a member of the culture themselves, who is very well versed in the cultural ideas, and you say to them, okay, if we do a character in this style, what should it be like? Make a cool, heroic character that's based on some real history, that's based on some real tradition. And you get this kind of interesting looking outcome. And I feel that although that might be a way of, you're not going to not offend everyone by doing that, because maybe this one person's ideas aren't, completely consistent, it's still a much more interesting way of doing character design. And you can still do these characters that are very based on a particular country or a particular nation or a particular history, but maybe you can do them in a way that isn't completely offensive.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's great. I mean, I think that there are a lot of pitfalls, just because you've got a member of that culture to design this character shouldn't necessarily make you immune to criticism. Because I think one of the funniest things about this is that when I've seen this happen in the past, the output tends to be one of two extremes. It's either almost as stereotyped as the non-official version, but with sort of one or two changes that are really significant within that culture but completely unnoticeable by everyone else, or it's fundamentally so different from the general cultural understanding of what that culture is like that people are just like, oh, is that a sheep? And like it's just completely sort of fails on that level. So it's not a slam dunk, but Microsoft is sort of sorely in need of some good PR recently after their atrocious solitaire things. That this is probably a good move for them.
I don't think you could see this as a response to the solitaire and fruit machine.
I think you can.
As the last 2 weeks, I don't think they're not listening to their podcast and going, right, quick, we better release something else. Yeah. As I said, someone having a particular cultural origin does not qualify them to speak for everyone of that culture, of course. And the person they've chosen to work on this is someone who studies these issues in great detail. I mean, and I agree with you. I think the resulting character might, at first glance, be something where you might expect people to object to it. I don't think that necessarily the details are sort of so massively radically different that you could see it as being, a complete reinterpretation of that idea. So it is sort of surprising on that level. But I think what's in an era where we're talking a lot about diversity in development and diversity in content, I think those two things can be very related. So if you want to create something that, again, uses particular heritage or information, why not do it in a way that is at least in discussion with that heritage, as opposed to sort of imposing yourself on it from outside?
Absolutely.
Right when this nonsense you're listening to right now comes out on the internet, Apple will be having their annual new iPhone event. Pundits are expecting some time during the event will be spent on demonstrating an entirely new Apple TV, which will support third-party games and apps. As usual in the lead-up to this company's new products, a complete lack of imagination is causing some to already declare the device a failure. Can Apple's scale alone allow it to create the world's first successful micro-console? And are they even doing that?
So I'm gonna say no, but then I tend to naysay about pretty much everything Apple releases, and obviously they have an excellent track record of doing very well. Obviously, not everything they do is successful, so it wouldn't be the first Apple product that hasn't destroyed the entire world. So the Apple TV is quite interesting. I have the feeling that it's not a huge deal in England, and it's a much bigger deal in the States. There was an Apple TV at the apartment that you and I stayed in for GDC this year, and it's quite cool. I used my PlayStation 3 as my main media center, and the Apple TV seemed to have all of the apps that had and a lot more, and actually had, quite a lot of subscription services for individual American network TV channels that I would quite like myself. So I quite like the Apple TV, actually. I think it's more functional than we're led to believe in this country. Yeah. If you put apps on there, I think that there is a hardcore Apple fan base who will just embrace anything they do to an extreme extent. So I think that there will be some success there. But I don't think it's going to be disruptive.
Yeah, I would love them to do something a bit more interesting with that idea, but I can't really imagine what that would be. And Apple, I like the fact that they're experimenting in this area, but I just don't know if the Apple philosophy is exactly the right way of handling TV. I agree with you. The thing that we had in the apartment was cool. I'm in this funny situation now where I have my TV and I have a PC and a PS4 connected to it, and I still use the features on the smart TV much more than I do any of the other things, because the PS4 you have to, go and unplug the joypad and turn it on, and then you have to do stuff. And the PC, like, you have to pick up the wireless keyboard and you have to go and like open a browser and stuff. And with the smart TV, you turn it on, you press 2 buttons, and then you're looking at the Netflix menu. And that's still a better experience, and it still works, probably faster, and you don't have to worry about the quality being weird, which you sometimes do on the other things. So I'm just into the smart TV thing. If Apple want to make an actual TV that is good and has all of the required stuff on it, like Twitch, which still doesn't have a smart TV client, if it has good smart TV apps and it is an actual TV, i.e. a screen, then I would consider buying it.
Well, I mean, I think that the actual Apple TV as it stands is sort of relatively close to that experience. Obviously, it is a different remote, and it's not as good as having it all on the TV itself. I think it's getting there.
Yeah.
And I think I'm actually quite glad that Apple don't make TVs.
Right.
I'd be a bit terrified by what that would be like, and I don't really want to have to buy an Apple TV and not a Sony or a Panasonic TV, because I don't want to miss out on this stuff. So in some ways, I'm kind of glad that they're not doing that. But yeah, I don't think we need to talk about this a huge amount. If they do manage to make a disruptive mic console, then that's just like another amazing achievement by them. But I'm voting no on it.
Yeah, I think it's unlikely. Anita Sarkeesian recently released a video discussing what she's termed as the women as reward trope in video games, the latest in her Tropes versus Women in Video Games series. In it, she cites games such as Metroid, The Witcher, and Resident Evil as presenting women as prizes to be won rather than as characters in their own right. She links these examples to the concept of male entitlement, the idea that men place unreasonable expectations and demands on women in society as they feel they deserve a certain response or behaviour from them. This has been one of her more controversial recent videos. What is your response?
I cannot believe that I'm being made to talk about this kind of thing on the podcast. My agent is going to call in and complain. I'm absolutely terrified about this. I watched this video. It was the first time that I'd watched any significant part of Anita Sarkeesian's Tropes in Games series. I thought it was quite well done, just technically. I thought it was quite amusing at times. She has taken a lot of pretty funny sections of sillier video games. I was personally actually slightly surprised with the fact that the faster you beat Metroid, the fewer clothes you'll see on Samus Aran when she takes off her battle suit. I was actually genuinely quite surprised by that. I don't really want to go too far into many of these topics because I think it's so divisive that it's not necessarily profitable. But there was one thing I wanted to look at quite specifically. The core concept of this is that these games are using women as rewards for doing well. And I can totally understand the negativity of the light that's being shone on that in this video. On the other hand, I think a lot of people agree that finding someone you really like and that you can fall in love with and sort of have a long relationship with is pretty much one of the greatest things that can happen to you. So I'm not sort of totally surprised that is used as a reward in sort of silly things like this. I mean, when you're young, I know when I was 15, I desperately wanted to date Rachel from Friends, and that was the kind of reward that I would have liked in a computer game. I don't think it has to be linked to sexuality, but of course a lot of the time it is. So as usual with these things, I think it's a lot more complicated than it's displayed, but I had a lot of time for what was being said.
Yeah, I think that this is one of her more interesting videos because it goes in a lot of different directions, and there is always some territory that I feel that she can't explore, mostly because she crams a lot into this and it's half an hour long. There's a lot of different facets to it. I agree with you. I think that there are some instances of where a character is kind of united with another character at the end as a sort of reward, where a relationship might be implied. And she does talk about this at one point. She says a lot of the time when female characters are given as a reward, it's a sexual reward, and then they're completely discarded and you never see them in the plot again. And that's absolutely the case in quite a lot of these games. So I think that's a good way of kind of addressing maybe what you said, but also that there are some instances where perhaps it's not completely as egregious as it is in other things. I mean, some of the stuff she points out, it really does bring home how the stuff that we were brought up with in the kind of early 90s, like these kind of arcadey games, like Double Dragon, where you have to fight your partner at the end and the winner gets the woman. It's just like the lowest level of anything you can possibly imagine. It really was that bad. So again, flagging that stuff I think is useful.
I was trying to remember when the last time, or maybe if it's ever been true, that I've been titillated by a computer game, because obviously that's the intention of a lot of this stuff, and a lot of the really explicit manga stuff that appears in my Twitter feed every so often is pretty close to pornography, frankly. But when I was growing up and at the more impressionable stage of my male development, I can't actually remember any games that I sort of found surprisingly titillating, which I guess would be an important aspect of this. I mean, I feel in general pretty uncomfortable talking about a lot of these issues because I'm mainly comfortable to let sort of others work this stuff out. I believe really, really strongly that we want to be as inclusive as possible to everyone, and I think that there's a lot of stuff that has been done wrong that needs to be corrected, but there's so many incredibly high emotions on both sides that I think it's almost impossible to have any kind of meaningful opinion that doesn't offend a bunch of people.
I think that's true. And again, something that she deals with is the fact that people very emotively want to defend everything in these categories because they don't sort of see that there's anything wrong with it. And at all points of cultural change, you have that. I suppose the only negative thing that I want to say about what she's doing in this video is that she takes all of these examples and then she links them to the concept that I introduced in previously, which is that of male entitlement, the idea that men in society place unreasonable expectations of women, which of course does happen. The problem that I have with this and a lot of this criticism is that it's extremely difficult to link a critical reading of something to scientific research which shows or proves a particular effect on a human being. Mostly because the state of academic cultural criticism and the state of social sciences are such that it is very difficult to do that. There have been some studies about the ways in which games can foster sexist behaviour in society. There were a few done between 2008 and 2010, small-scale studies, that have shown that there might be some relationship there. But all in all, I think it's really difficult when a critic is making these very emphatic statements about causes and effects that culture has, where not only does she not cite anything that anyone can look up in this video, but also the general state of that is quite confused. Because it's criticism, you don't have to do that. You can present this as an argument, which is what she does, and I do wish people would understand that. You can't debunk her by saying, oh, she didn't cite this study. That's not how that works, not how cultural criticism works. On the other hand, I would like to see this conversation opened up a bit more, and I think it would be good to provide ways in which people can come at it from that angle and see the very real evidence that does exist out there about these issues.
Now, I think so I have a slightly different viewpoint on a lot of this stuff. I think that sort of trying to engage with this kind of criticism is almost against the form. So when I see a lot of this kind of thing, I think it's I guess somewhat hyperbolic a good amount of the time, and I kind of think that I've actually come to think that there's some validity to that, because I think when you have something that's as difficult to define as say sexism in culture, where so many things, small things that on their own could be taken as acceptable, kind of add up in some impossible to define way to a kind of larger toxic problem. I think that when it's so hard to actually define what's actually going wrong, that the approach of sort of being hyperbolic is a way of confronting people to get so angry about the hyperbolic nature of the criticism as to eventually be pushed into confronting the things in their lives that actually are a problem.
Yeah.
So it's a bizarre thing by being sort of in some ways unreasonable. You are being much more effective at causing change through high emotion than being reasonable. I think that the one way that I'd like to see the people like Anita Sarkeesian who do this kind of thing embrace that is to understand that if your form involves necessarily making people angry in order to promote change, you need to find a way of being better able to deal with some of the negative stuff thrown at you. Although now I say that, it's probably a bad thing to say, given that some of the stuff that happens to these guys is genuinely completely unacceptable. So maybe I take that back.
Sure.
But I hope you understand what I'm trying to say.
I definitely do. I definitely do. I think there is some sort of expectation that, you know, people are going to be reasonable about this, and that's not a good expectation. I mean, that's fine, but I mean, yes, I wouldn't say that she had that expectation now. Certainly, I think that everything you said is true. I think that there is nothing wrong with making points in a strong way and perhaps sometimes stating things in a way which might be considered to be oversimplified, perhaps, in order to provoke a reaction. However, that can lead to this escalating hyperbole on both sides. You're being divisive, so you're trying to create sides. And if you look at the way that people respond to Anita Sarkeesian is, in the main, largely completely ludicrous, which is one of the reasons that I wanted to have a more in-depth discussion about her work on this show, because I feel like we try to at least treat things in an even-handed and intelligent way. But a lot of people will just say, well, all of this is rubbish because of X. That's what hyperbole leads to. And what I'm saying is that I think that she could go outside and around this topic and really look at some of these secondary social implications that she's drawing and really analyse those and show, if she believes these to be true, which she does, show what the basis of that belief is so that people can analyse and engage with that. Because I think a lot of what she says is true, but it would be good to provide some way in to discussing that empirically.
Yeah, you're right. The negative aspect of what I was talking about is that it alienates a group of people, and sometimes that group of people get together and start being even worse back. So I definitely agree with that. Yeah, it's a really terrifying thing to talk about. This specific topic is something which gets you absolutely roasted online if you frankly step out and say anything about it. So I kind of hope that we don't. But I think you're right. It is important to try and start talking about this stuff in a relatively sensible way, and hope that it doesn't go wrong.
I feel that the state of criticism on this now has moved on past these ideas being new to a lot of people in the games industry, despite them being around for centuries. I think we've now moved past that, and I don't think people should be afraid to talk about these discussions in an intelligent way, provided they're sensitive to the issues. And they recognise that there is a real problem around sexism and games and sexism in society. I think that is a real problem, and being able to talk about these things properly is important without kind of raining nonsense on one side of the argument. So yes, I also hope that people take this discussion in that spirit and that we get a good response. Perhaps, as we said before, that's naive. Let's move on. Now we have a section of the show which is a new section, and it's specific to this week, and it's called Ian Tries to Convince Paul to Play Metal Gear Solid 5, The Phantom Pain. So Ian, please take it away.
Well, I was not consulted on this section because I actually think that Metal Gear Solid 5 is too good for you, and that you are just going to have some massive problem with the really fun but not particularly literary aspects of the story. And I think it's probably best for the world if you don't play it. But if I was talking to someone more reasonable than you, I would tell them that Metal Gear Solid 5 is excellent.
Right.
It has this amazing approach, which is this kind of lots and lots of levels, but each level it being an open world. So I'm so bored of open world games like GTA, where you have this entire perfectly modelled world with a lot of systems in it, and you never get to do anything interesting in it, and it just seems to lose sort of any point to the stuff, and you're just driving around looking for somewhere to take your girlfriend bowling or something. And it's kind of just really, I have to say, just really boring. The thing that Metal Gear Solid 5 does, which is so cool, is the idea of having smaller open world levels where they create a brilliant set of completely coherent systems, and you can solve the level in any way you like. And if you can find a way that the designers weren't expecting to finish a level, then you get a great reward because you get to do it in probably an easier way, more intelligent way. And by all accounts, the developers have spent so much time getting cool scripted responses to all the things they could think of you doing that it feels so completely rewarding. I think that there's I've only played a few hours so far, but I think there's a good chance it's up there in like my top 5 or 10 favorite games of all time. It smacks quite a lot of Thief 1 and 2 and Hitman in terms of how it's got this open approach to levels. They've introduced a lot of supernatural stuff to the plot this time, which I don't think they had done in the past. And while I don't generally like that thing, it smacks so much of Resident Evil 4 to me. And I really, really enjoyed the crazy schlock action horror stuff of Resident Evil 4. It's really cool. So I'm pretty in love with this game right now, and a lot of other people are as well. So there you go.
Yeah, it sounds interesting to me. I mean, I guess I just don't feel like I have time for a really finicky kind of open world game where, you know, it's very heavily stealth based and you get punished very badly for doing things wrong. That's kind of my negative preconception of this game, is I'm going to be kind of fiddling around trying to find stuff in these big environments and dying a lot. And is that accurate?
I actually don't think it is.
Okay.
One of the things that I've always found frustrating about Metal Gear Solid games is that I've always been unclear about how stealthy you're supposed to be. Because on the one hand, it's a stealth game, and you always start the game stealth, and I guess there's some ideal of finishing levels never being noticed. But so many of the systems and the gameplay is to do with action. I mean, it's a game which spends a vast amount of the time looking at developing new weapons for you to shoot people with and to get into action with, that I think it's a game where it's kind of, each level has two sections. There's the first bit where you're being stealthy, and at some point it goes wrong, and that's interesting, and then it turns into a different kind of game, and that's completely valid. So I had the problem of not really feeling that the feedback was strong enough about what, you know, I kind of felt like, wait, I have to make this decision too much? But the honest truth is that I think it's not even particularly a thing if you can play it how you want to, although you can. It's just totally cool that at some point stuff does go wrong, and you're not completely screwed then. You can, then it just turns into a slightly different game.
Oh, okay. No, that definitely sounds more interesting. You're right. I mean, obviously I am a ludicrous person, and the plot narrative stuff does put me off. I think I might buy the game and then just like leave the cutscene, the famous cutscene running at the start, and then just kind of play it without seeing that.
Well, unfortunately, you have to interact with it. So.
Oh no, that's terrible. I'm not playing it then.
The first hour, the hour and 15 minutes for the prologue, I just feel like you've got to embrace it. Like, this is probably the 5th Metal Gear Solid game I've played, and I haven't played any of them very much, but I played them all for a few hours. And I kind of finally feel like I'm willing to embrace what they do, and I'm on board with it now. It's really crazy.
I don't know if I'll be onboarding. I'm going to announce that we're going to do a competition next week, and it's going to be to win a copy of the amazing Sega Mega Drive Collected Works, which is published by ROM Alert, designed and edited by Darren Wall, and written by the amazing Keith Stewart. It's a brilliant coffee table book. So I would like to invite you to listen to next week's show, where we will give out competition details for that. So there you go. You have been warned. Now it's time for Ian's Magic Corner, where Ian talks about the collectible card game Magic the Gathering. Take it away, Ian.
Okay, I'm going to try and keep it short this week because I'm quite tired. We've been talking for a long time already. So I was talking to Visiting the Village Magic the Gathering correspondent Tom Richards last night, and we were trying to work out what might be a fun thing to talk about, and something organically came out of the conversation, which is something called Iron Root Chef. So one of the big events every year in Magic the Gathering is called the Community Cup. I hope I have that right. I believe that I do. This is where it's a teams game. It's 2 teams of 8. It's a relatively small competition, and it's 8 people who work for Wizards of the Coast, who will almost always have been ex-pros that at some point were hired by Wizards to be involved with Wizards, against 8 people elected from the Wizards community. So generally elected for both being quite good at Magic and also being really popular. So I would imagine that big Magic YouTubers are the kind of people that get elected to this. And they have quite an unusual set of events at this thing, and one of them is called Iron Root Chef. Now, Iron Root Chef is a pun on the TV show Iron Chef and the magic card Iron Root Tree Folk, which is cool in itself. Anyway, so this is a team game where you get given 5 ingredients. An ingredient is a specific card, and each team gets these 5 specific cards, and they have to make 8 decks, 1 deck for each player. 5 decks contain exactly 1 ingredient each, and 3 decks include exactly 2 ingredients each. And then the teams have half an hour to use the entire pool of standard legal cards to create a deck around these cards. And deck building, given a specific constraint like that, is super interesting. And basically, you'll be asked to... So the people who are skilled enough to do this, who really have enough of an understanding about the metagame to be able to look at one card and work out what is going to be a good deck around that, are pretty great at what they do, and they do exist as well. So you have half an hour to do that, and then you play a tournament with it, and the actual judging of this particular event, you get half of the points for how you did in the tournament, and the other half, which is the bit that I really liked, is actually from a sort of reality TV, the Great British Bake Off-esque judging panel, who go and look at your decks and judge it on creativity, boldness, and adherence to the theme ingredient, which sounds like exactly the kind of ridiculous metrics that you'd actually get in a reality show. So I really like this, and this is just another example of how awesome and crazy Magic is.
I can't believe the fact that this is such a hardcore game, and it's so complicated, and the rules change all the time, and there are all these different ways of playing it, that they've invented this meta tournament thing that is slightly cookery themed, that has a panel. I mean, it's just beyond all recognition. It's when a game becomes like more of a language than an actual game itself, and people are willing to play around with it. I mean, that's why they've been doing this for such a long time. It's because it's developed into this absolutely insane thing. I don't know if I can cope with this anymore. I might have to start playing Magic. That should be
good.
We should have a segment where you and Tom teach me Magic. I don't know why I'm suggesting this.
That sounds terrible.
I need to get out of this right now. Okay, now it's time for our regular segment, games that were released this week in 2005, thanks to Eurogamer. Now, producer Jimmy is trying a different format this week, which I don't like, but I'm going to embrace it anyway. Okay, so this week we had a game called Coded Arms on the PSP, which is a kind of crappy shooter, and we'll ignore. But I think the most interesting game this week is perhaps Colosseum Roads to Freedom, and that is a game that sounds like this.
All right. That's right. All right. Good. That's right. That's right. That's right. Good. All right. That's right.
And hopefully you will have just heard a sound clip that producer Jimmy has spliced in of a training section in the game. Now, I've looked into this game a little bit. We had some very interesting input from Nick Marshall on Twitter. Thank you very much, Nick Marshall. And he says, I loved that game. I even got every ending somehow. The later stages were fantastic as it suddenly decided to have a story. So it's not just this kind of weird gladiator simulation. It kind of evolves. And he said, I really, really want to play this again now just to see its sudden shift into Roman scandal simulator. That sounds amazing. I really wish that we had a copy of that here.
Yeah, we're going to have to get it off eBay. We've been talking recently about possibly having a video version of Visiting the Village. And if anything was ever going to make me do that, the video for Colosseum Road to Freedom would be it, because it is really one of the funniest things in the world. I thoroughly recommend you look it up on YouTube.
Yes,
and I want to rush to Jimmy's defense, by the way, because Paul denigrating this new format, he's just said, put it so there aren't like a bunch of different references for Hello Kitty Roller Rescue because it came off on 4 different platforms. This is a much superior thing. And thank you very much, Jim, and don't listen to Paul.
I like doing it by platform. Hello Kitty Roller Rescue, as you mentioned, on the PS2, PC, Xbox and GameCube. I don't really know what that is and I don't care. Madden NFL 2006, we know what that is. And Musashi Samurai Legends, which looks like a kind of bad open world action game. I don't know. Pilot Down Behind Enemy Lines, do you know what that is?
I'm just wondering if that's based on the film Behind Enemy Lines or like a sort of a crappy knockoff.
I don't know, man. I'm going to say no.
It's going to be too hard to find that out quickly. So
The Great British Football Quiz on PS2, The Incredible Hulk Ultimate Destruction on PS2, Xbox and GameCube, Tom Clancy's Rainbow Six Lockdown on PS2, Xbox. I don't know what that is either. I think that might well be some kind of spin-off of Rainbow Six.
Yeah, some kind of boring consolidation. Yeah, I think we really kind of blew the load early with this week, with Colosseum, Road to Freedom. All these other games seem fairly boring. Although,
I know.
Madden NFL 2006
I have
was
that one.
a pretty good entry. That was one of the kind of, I think, really strong ones of those, and I played that quite a lot.
Yes, I had that on the GameCube, and I think I played it all of 3 times. Let's move on to the top 10 UK Steam games for this week. At number 10, it's Killer is Dead, which is there because it's 80% off. Number 9 is Killing Floor 2, which is on a weekend sale. Number 8 is Football Manager 2006 pre-order. Number 7 is Ark Survival Evolved. Number 6 is Grim Fandango Remastered at 66% off. Number 5 is Rocket League. Number 4 is CSGO. Number 3 is GTA 5. Number 2 is Mad Max. And number 1 is Metal Gear Solid 5.
Good.
Yes. Only thing I want to say about this, Grim Fandango Remastered is definitely something that you should check out. I'm so disappointed that the final third of the game is apparently terrible, and I still haven't finished the final third of the game, but the middle section, as everyone says, is very good. So do check that out. Right, let's move on to your listener questions for this week. Not as good a crop this time as last week, and I don't feel like you're not putting the effort in, guys. So I'm going to blame, if this section is weak, it's entirely on you. But anyway, thank you for sending in questions. Mr. Hahn says, what do you think of Three's free app, which has a limited number of plays and you can get more by watching video ads? This is a thing now in free-to-play, these video ad things. I believe that they're generally considered to work more effectively when you get in-game rewards for watching the video ads. I'm not sure that limited number of plays is going to particularly make this worthwhile. I haven't actually played Threes. That's the sum total of my thoughts on that. Any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, in general, I kind of view my time as quite valuable, and if I've got time to play a game, I don't want to be sort of compromising that time with having to watch ads. So if I was into a free-to-play game, I would probably rather spend a small amount of money than have to have the experience really compromised by that. I mean, it just seems pretty bad to me, I guess, but then a lot of free-to-play stuff does, so...
Andrew Roper asks, who would win between yourself and Ian in a poetry slam? And the answer is Ian, because of his poetry suplex. James Parker asks, do you think we've reached a tipping point where we'll see the end of punting on 4th and short situations? I'm going to leave that one to you.
Yeah, wow. Quite an on-point NFL question. Yeah. It's definitely going to keep getting less and less common, although... head coaches tend to be complete pussies, so we're not going to completely get rid of it. But yeah, already in college, where punters tend to be pretty terrible, you're seeing a lot of going for it on 4th and short. So I appreciate the real football question.
Yeah, so this is really a thing now. People are kind of it might completely be phased out. Do you think?
I don't think it'll be completely phased out, especially not when you're on your half of the field. But the maths about if you've got like 4th and 1 or 4th and 2, and you're in the opponent's red zone, to say you're on their 10-yard line, the actual maths just say it's overwhelmingly better to go for it, because even if you don't make it, you've got them pinned back so far. That the most likely situation is that they end up having to punt, and you get it back on about the 50-yard line, which it produces just a great expectation result. So in terms of the closer you get to the enemy goal line, the much less punting we're going to see.
Okay. Jim Didrikson says, when you plan a game, how much is planning a game that sells versus a game that you want to make? I think that you have to make something you want to make, otherwise it's very unlikely that you'll finish, or you'll just die of boredom and hatred of yourself before you finish. So it has to be something you want to make. The most important thing is something that you feel strongly about that you can put a lot of your creative input into for a long time. So by virtue of the fact it has to be something you want to make first. In terms of planning a game that sells, I like to have a way of believing that it can sell a lot of copies. If I can't think of any possible way that something could sell a lot of copies, then I'm not going to want to work on it. I have to have the slightest inkling that it could be a big success. I guess you feel similar.
Yeah, I do feel the same. I think that, a lot of the time, the games that end up selling great are the games which no one thought there was a market for before you made that game to be exceptionally good. But there are certain genres of game which are probably always going to be so niche that they won't ever get there. Although, having said that, things like Euro Truck Simulator, I mean, apart from a 2D platformer, I'm not sure what kind of genre you could really say it about, unless it is a very, very heavily saturated genre. So yeah, I mean, in general, what are we doing here? We're making games that we want to make, but it is really important that you have a sense of what people want to play. I mean, in general, I think people make many more mistakes by trying to make their game commercial than they do when they go super true to themselves. I think a lot of really bad disasters happen when you start making a game that is the kind of game you want to play, and then at some point you start caring more about whether it's good for YouTube or whether it's going to be accepted by demographic X, and that's where you start really going off the rails, because unless you're a real professional, you probably don't know how to make a game that is attractive to a specific audience.
Yeah, that stuff I think should kind of filter into your brain at the creative stage and not be something, if a game's going to be good for YouTube, it will be good for YouTube because you conceived it as such. Maybe not in those terms, but you conceived a game that was fun to watch by virtue of what you designed, I think. I don't think you can impose that on a design.
Yeah.
Okay, now we move on to the final section of our show, which is dedicated to long-time Mode 7 community member Cheshire, and we're going to call it The Thoughts of Cheshire, because he sends us a very in-depth response to the podcast every week. Thank you. Thank you, Dave. So on Trine 3, he says, is there a way to leverage previous indie IP without bringing along the baggage of making a sequel, or does that happen inherently via the company brand? I mean, I think the only other way that I've seen this happen is with kind of remixes, like Binding of Isaac Rebirth. Also, things like characters featuring in other games can be quite nice. Maybe setting things in the same world, but generally I think you have to make a sequel. Company brand is very important. I think Introversion have done really well with their brand. People kind of know what their games stand for. The Behemoth, I guess, as well. Any thoughts on this?
Yeah, when you can get a strong identity of your games without it being a specific gaming IP, when all your games kind of feel the same and start having such a strong feeling that they work as this kind of large IP, that's really great. But no, in general, if you have a specific game IP, people love it for a reason and they want a sequel. They don't want it to suddenly be a karting game, shall we say.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Moving on, Dave's thoughts on Satellite Rain. He says, I have a friend who's very heavily into RTS. He's been hooked on Satellite Rain recently. Kind of an XCOM meets Shadowrun mashup from the looks of it. I haven't played it yet, but he's raving about it. You have played Satellite Rain. Any quick thoughts?
Yeah, I think we talked about it at reasonable length. I'm not particularly surprised it's a game that a lot of people can really like. It's just that it looked like a game that did a lot of things that I was really into, and then ended up being a really completely different kind of game. So it was sort of disappointing to me.
On linearity in open worlds, he says, I think I may have phrased my thoughts about it a bit poorly last time. I wasn't suggesting that linearity is mandatory by design in an open world, but rather it's a secondary artifact of any sort of progression mechanism used to motivate the player. Even an open world requires milestones of a sort to create a sense of achievement and to gate later progression to some extent. I think this is something that designers generally struggle with, is how to impose structure in these things that are supposed to be exploratory. I mean, certainly No Man's Sky is one where I've seen in the interviews they've been doing as it's evolved, increasingly how they've been talking about sort of how to structure it and what the player's actually doing and stuff, and I feel like it's just this kind of eternal quandary. So you got to have some linearity, I think, is definitely a requirement.
Yeah, I still don't I'm having difficulty wrapping my frazzled brain around this concept. Is linearity necessary when you have a progression mechanism? I don't think necessarily true, but I suppose you have to get better and your challenges have to get better. I don't know. I'm going to have to think about this again.
I think it kind of has to inherently be true because progression has to be on a line, I suppose. Anyway, maybe one for next week. Mentoring leagues, we're talking about how to do multiplayer progression with different leagues. Mentoring leagues would be interesting, where people can specifically volunteer to train or be trained by other people from a different skill range. I love that idea. I really would like that idea. Again, I've talked about developers don't really need to facilitate multiplayer stuff in general. I think that can kind of happen within the community, but I think more structured mentoring within some of these multiplayer games would be good.
Yeah, I think that's a really fun idea,
yeah. Right, I think we could... Do you want to do the television and film lounge area for this week, or would you like to wrap up the show at this point?
We'll wrap up the show, I guess.
All right. Well, in that case, it's been fantastic to do another week of this wonderful show, and it's been great that we're getting new listeners every week. That's still continuing to happen. If you'd like to follow us on Twitter, I'm Mode7Games, and he's Ian Hardingham, and we shall see you next week.
See you next week, and thank you for listening.
That's it, children. Time for bed. Don't forget to pay us a visit at www.visitingthevillage.com.